So yeah, we'll switch topics a little bit here, but there are some similarities as well. One kind of overall trend when it relates to Project 2025 and its policy proposals are that, as Annie mentioned in the introduction, is that so a lot of it is geared towards kind of limiting regulatory regimes and the overall scope of government. But when it comes to issues like reproductive justice and immigration, we see some notable exceptions. These are within Project 2025 and similar plans. There are things that dramatically increase the federal government's enforcement apparatuses and the weaponization of criminalization and surveillance policies that create an ultimately more repressive environment overall. So while the text of 2025, Project 2025, apologies, and similar right-wing plans kind of do, as it relates to immigration, kind of allied some of the more specific, incendiary rhetoric that we've seen. What we're also seeing is that this is the policy architecture for those, violent and expulsionary campaigns. This is creating the architecture for which, white nationalism requires. Many of the proposals in Project 2025 are familiar to those who followed immigration policy for decades, but most recently in 2017 to 2020, and that's because a lot of these plans were first drafted and attempted during that time. And Project 2025 is kind of a consolidation of those efforts and a revision, recognizing some of the obstacles that were in place at that time and some of the difficulties that they encountered as they attempted to first implement many of these policies. Um, so the policy proposals that we're going to be talking about here are often predicated on false border crisis narratives that are perpetuated and accepted by particularly the right, but also the center. And these narratives ignore the ineffectiveness of draconian crackdowns and have this false notion that human mobility can be limited in the face of ongoing climate and economic instability, and other things like our country's obligations to honor asylum laws or honor asylum under international law. They also depict a climate of law. They also depict a climate of lawlessness, apologies, both along the borders and throughout the country, leading into the bigoted scapegoating of immigrants that is reliably a feature of campaign rhetoric and espoused by candidates at all levels of government. You saw this during the debates most recently, but also, these, kind of ongoing scapegoating of immigrant communities across the country in an attempt to kind of gin up racist support for candidates. So when these border crisis narratives are accepted, it creates a climate where presidential candidates are able to pledge unprecedented resources towards things like mass deportations and the criminalization of immigrant communities. Tom Homan, the former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is less bombastic than someone who's actually running for office, but is ultimately still advocating for many of these same things, saying things like, I don't think we can, or I'm not going to fool myself into thinking we can remove 20 million people, but we're going to give it one hell of a shot and remove as many as we can. It's a little more measured, but ultimately that's still calling for mass deportation and the dedication of resources for removing people from this country at a previously unprecedented scale. Tellingly, Tom Homan, after leaving ICE, he became a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he contributed to Project 2025's immigration policy recommendations. The principal author of these immigration and border security recommendations is Ken Cuccinelli, who was also a former administration official and a longtime ally of the anti-immigrant movement, dating back to his time in the early aughts as first a state legislator and later Virginia's attorney general. So what's being recommended in Project 2025? A significant amount of the proposals re-implement or expand past policies that weren't continued by the Biden administration. This includes expanding border walls and detention capacity, aggressively deputizing local law enforcement to enforce immigration law via the 287G program, particularly. Such agreements between 2017 and 2020 quadrupled. We haven't seen a great expansion since 2021, but very tellingly, very few of those agreements have been rescinded as well. So a lot of this enforcement architecture remains in place. So as troubling as these recommendations are, and the emphasis, there's something even more really disconcerting about this. And that's kind of a broad thing throughout Project 2025. And that's the emphasis on information sharing across governments to marginalize immigrants, and recognizing that type of kind of interagency communication is what ultimately creates and fosters a climate of fear. If such practices are realized, it would create a vast chilling effect, broadly discouraging immigrants and their family from accessing benefits and resources they are eligible for. This will have vast ramifications for virtually every facet of public life, and it can further isolate immigrant communities from accessing healthcare, education, employment, and housing, among other things. The first kind of portion of this discusses Project 25 discusses what the executive branch can do via executive order. The executive branch has significant leeway over federal immigration policy, and it's understandable, therefore, that Project 2025 would emphasize these policy recommendations that could be enacted via executive order. In other words, without congressional approval. Among the executive actions Project 2025 recommends are eliminating humanitarian programs like temporary protected status for individuals from particular countries. And in some instances, or some messengers and contributors to Project 2025, that includes eliminating the program entirely. Others are a little more targeted and saying that, you know, people from particular countries should no longer be eligible. Project 2025 further conditions the maintenance of the asylum system as well on nebulous concepts such as operational control. This notion that if there is no operational control of the border, so-called, that the asylum system could essentially be shut down. There's a version of this that's currently in place, and you know, that is being utilized by the Biden administration, but we also recognize that, you know, the anti-immigrant movement, its allies, including the Heritage Foundation and other contributors to Project 2025, could make this even more draconian and further attack the asylum system. And what that would ultimately do is effectively eliminate multiple avenues of so-called legal immigration, and in all likelihood encourage more unauthorized migration, setting the stage for further cruel displays of border maintenance and control. In addition to proposed executive orders, Project 2025 also includes many policies that would require congressional approval. Some of these items include nationwide workplace enforcement and eliminating federal support for humanitarian organizations that assist migrants both along the border and in communities across the country. The plan also calls for the elimination of certain grounds for asylum and funding increases for immigration and customs enforcement operations beyond what a future administration could implement via, you know, agency reorganization and reallocation of existing agency resources. This also comes at a time when, since it was founded in 2003, immigration customs enforcement and the enforcement operation budget of this country has already tripled. I mean, there's a vast amount of resources already being dedicated to this, and what Project 2025 seeks to do is further increase those. So supplementing the Project 2025 are proposals from past administration officials publicly claiming that they'll pursue some things once they enter the White House. So, you know, looking beyond what is in the text of Project 2025, looking at what some of these contributors have said and past administration officials and likely future administration officials, recognizing that this doesn't stop with Project 2025 as written. Such these policies include redirecting military funding to further expand detention and deportation programs, halting refugee resettlement, paving the way for local law enforcement and the National Guard to enforce immigration law by invoking the Insurrection Act. This contributes to a very dangerous rhetorical climate that is only escalated as election day draws closer. For example, this month, past administration officials began expressing support for so-called remigration, a concept that's been popularized by white nationalists and the European far right that involves stripping immigrants of their authorized status and deporting them. The scope of such policy has been kept deliberately nebulous, but the intent is clear, signaling to the far right that the full power of the deportation machine will be levied against immigrant communities at all levels in a way that's previously unseen this century. And you know, even without kind of the the publication of plans like Project 2025, it's important to note that the electoral far right is currently working to further marginalize immigrant communities and erode democracy. So Project 2025 is not existing as a vacuum. It's being seen as a continuation of what is occurring, in the halls of power today. Some of the right's most salient priorities in Congress this last year have been pretty illustrative in this regard. Top among those is the so-called SAVE Act, which proponents present as a solution to the virtually non-existent issue of non-citizen voting. The bill serves two primary purposes: to further marginalize immigrant communities and preemptively cast suspicion on election results. The consequences of right-wing appointments to the federal judiciary are something that should also be noted here. Courts have previously delayed or blocked immigration-related policies, and including things like the Muslim ban and eliminating deportation relief for undocumented youth through the DACA program, to varying levels of success. Ultimately, some of these policies were enacted and others were blocked, but recognizing that there was a way in which the courts were playing a role in dividing and blocking some of these policies at first. But that landscape has changed. Courts should not be considered the only bulwark against authoritarian attacks, and their chances of blocking such policies in the future is substantially less likely than it was 8 years ago, given the remaking of the federal judiciary. Which kind of brings us to the longer term goals of the anti-immigrant movement and the implications for them if 2025 or Project 2025 policies are implemented. The anti-immigrant movement's goals have always had an extended time horizon that far surpasses the recommendations of Project 2025. For decades, the movement has sought policy changes requiring the Supreme Court to reverse legal precedent that in some cases are over a century old. Two leading policies are eliminating U.S. citizenship for U.S.-born children, regardless of their parents' immigration status, as established in 1898's decision, United States versus Wong Kim Ark. This is also known as birthright citizenship. Another being the right of all children to receive a public education, going alongside what Annie was talking about earlier. As established in 1981's decision, Plyler versus Doe. Earlier this year, the Heritage Foundation published a policy brief encouraging states to charge tuition to public students or public school students that are either undocumented or have undocumented parents, with the explicit aim of setting up a challenge to overturn Plyler v. Doe. Of course, we've recently seen the right successfully use this strategy to overturn reproductive rights in nearly half the states in the country. It's important to keep in mind that the right is also waging fights outside the scope and published plans like Project 2025. And if anything, Project 2025 just kind of creates the policy landscape that would make the achievement of some of these other goals even more likely. So now to a slide that we've already seen before. We're wrapping up here, but just to kind of reiterate some of the stuff that Annie was talking about in the beginning here. The harsh realities of the anti-immigrant movement's exclusionary vision and drive for authoritarian enforcement underscores the need for our movements to engage in approaches that both block continuing attacks on immigrant communities, but also build policies and movement architecture that supports these communities. 15 years ago, the immigrant rights movement united in its opposition to Arizona's SB 1070. It took years, but portions of that law were ultimately ruled unconstitutional, and the national face of that law, Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio, was ultimately voted out of office. Simultaneously, the movement applied relentless pressure on the White House, leading to the creation of DACA, providing deportation relief for some undocumented youth. These were very hard-fought victories, and they need to be defended. Today, we're seeing states across the country adopt SB 1070-style laws. And a federal government operating on Project 2025's policy recommendations will only embolden state lawmakers to pursue more invasive and exclusionary policies, just as the anti-immigrant movement would feel empowered to pursue its broader attacks on immigrants' constitutional protections and rights. In this moment of growing authoritarianism and anti-democratic efforts, we must marshal movement resources toward strategies to block continuing attacks, but also stand in our commitment to a more just and inclusive world. We must reject attacks against our immigrant neighbors and reaffirm our commitment to displaced people around the world. The fear-mongering and scapegoating stemming from border crisis narratives that are cynically used by both the right and the center for perceived electoral gain must be opposed. And together we can build a world that rejects the violence of borders and reaffirms the humanity of everyone, regardless of where they were born. We'll move over. We got these resources again. Annie mentioned that they'll be said. And after that, we're just thank you, and we look forward to speaking to you during this Q&A session. So thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.